All right, welcome back to Chicago English Sunchan Alex's book club. As the title says, the Twits. These chapters, three chapters, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. We're going to get right into it. What happened in the last few chapters? We are introduced to the main characters, Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit. And then they described them for a little bit, right? How they look, how they, their personality. I really like how Roald Dahl talks about even if you have a big nose and big teeth and double chin, if you are a good person inside, that shines out. Okay? So remember that. If you have good thoughts, you're a beautiful person no matter what. I like that. Now, they started playing tricks on each other. And the tricks, and what did they call them? They started plotting tricks, and they're going to escalate, and they're going to get funnier, and they're going to get worse, and they're going to get crazier. So that's what these three chapters are. But let's first jump into the vocabulary. I'm going to do something a little different with the vocabulary. I'm going to read you the vocabulary so you can look at it, write it down, and listen to the pronunciation. I did a read over. All right, so let's do that in 3, 2, 1. All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that. Tell me in class or type down below, do you like the new vocabulary where I'm reading it? Or do you want the old vocabulary? Let me know. All right, let's go. Also, when I'm reading, I've got my kids here, so they're making noise. So I'm going to try to stay as focused as I can. But if I make some mistakes with skipping a word or pronouncing the word wrong, I'm reading through the camera. Let me know. I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. So let's get going. Here we go. Chapter 7, the wormy spaghetti. Oh no. Do you know what a worm is? A worm. Oh boy. And we know what spaghetti is. I can guess what's gonna happen. Not delicious. All right, so the next day, remember last they did the frog? She couldn't sleep because he put the frog in the bed, and then he said it was the what was the word? He called it the skillywigger. Ooh, crazy. All right. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. I knew it. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. Cooking clothes, vocab word. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. You know, I would never eat if I was married to these people, I would not eat their food. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. Hey, my spaghetti's moving, cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. It's a new kind, Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no. Oh, look there they are at the dinner table eating. Gross. Had no worms. How am I going to do this? Worms. It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Let me do this, guys. I am so sorry. I need to figure this out. This is so bad. I got a new holder. Good. It's delicious. Eat up while it's nice and hot. Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. It's not as good as the ordinary kind, he said, talking with his mouth full. It's too squishy. I find it very tasty, Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. I find it rather bitter, Mr. Twit said. It's got a distinctly bitter flavor. Buy the other kind next time. Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy? Oh, sorry. Can you see that? Squishy? Oh boy. Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. My mom would kill me if I did that. Why? He said. And why it had a nasty bitter taste. Why? He said. Because it was worms, cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stomping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. Oh, there she is, clapping, stomping, rocking, laughing. Oh, man, I would be so angry. All right. Oh, I have a supporter. And chapter 8. The funny walking stick. I like this one. Because this is mean, but it's not like, oh, giving worms is like, oh my gosh, that's just bad. The funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his workshed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny. A penny is like a bekwan, so no thicker. Let me see. So this, like thick, no thicker, so very thin. This is not even a bekwan, but the same. A penny is American money. Piece of wood onto the bottom of her stick. So there you can see her stick. He's putting it on the bottom. I love this trick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small. The next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. She didn't notice because it was so small, right? Let me get this correct. Does that look good, guys? Say yes, I can hear you. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck another tiny bit of wood. Every night, he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very, very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it happening. This is like the frog in boiling water. I will tell you about the frog in boiling water trick, but theory, or I don't know what it is, in class, okay? Man, do I have that right? Please tell me. Impossible to know heaven. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day. Every day that goes by. But you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. That's right. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. That sticks too long for you, Mr. Twit said to her one day. All right, see that? Look at it. It's all the way up to her shoulder, right? Oh, and she didn't even notice. Why, so it is, Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was. There's something wrong, all right, Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. What can have happened? That's weird, Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. It must suddenly have grown longer. Don't be a fool, Mr. Twit said. How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow. Then what on earth is happening? Cried Mrs. Twit. Let's do. Does that look good? You can tell me. I can hear you. It's not the stick. It's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now. He said that. I've been noticing it for some time now. That's not true, cried Mrs. Twit. You're shrinking. You're a shrinking woman, said Mr. Twit. That's not possible. Oh, yes, it jolly well is, said Mr. Twit. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days. Never, she cried. Let's see. Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks. Mrs. Twit began to feel so terribly. She had to sit down. That's funny. Now this is funny too. So this is a clever trick. Takes time. That's why I like it. In chapter 9, Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. The shrinks is when you shrink. Old people get it. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, There you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground. Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Ah, look at that. She's not touching. See, this is clever. I like this trick. See, the worms is not so clever. The worms in your spaghetti is just dirty, just gross. This is a clever trick. Come on. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little extra bit onto the stick, he had done the same to the 4 legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair, he cried, and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air. Mrs. Twit went white with fear. Her face went white because she's so scared, right? This is kind of scary. Oh. All right. How does that look? You can tell me. I can hear. You've got the shrinks, cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol, like a gun pistol. You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen. Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit still remembered the worms. Yeah, the nasty, nasty worms. Where were they? In his spaghetti. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. See, I told you my mistakes. I've got my kids talking to me in the back. They love talking to me. I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks, he said. What? Gasped Mrs. Twit. What happens? Your head shrinks into your body, and your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes. Did you see that? A bundle of old clothes. Let's see. I can't bear it, cried Mrs. Twit. It's a terrible disease. It's a terrible disease, said Mr. Twit. The worst in the world. How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. At the rate you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly, I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. But isn't there anything we can do? Cried Mrs. Twit. There's only one cure for the shrinks, said Mr. Twit. Give me a minute. A second. Tell me, she cried. Oh, tell me quickly. We'll have to hurry. I'm reading through the camera. We will. We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs. Twit. You won't last long if you don't, said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. What is it I must do? Cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched, said Mr. Twit. All right. And that is that. That is the end of it. You've got to be stretched. Okay. So, no. Let's see this really quick. So, like I said, I make mistakes. We all must make mistakes. I'm reading through the camera. I've got my kids outside and it's late. So, I hope you enjoyed this. So the worm spaghetti, not my thing. But the shrinks, that is a good trick. All right, everyone, have a great night. See you next week. Keep up the reading, super readers.